sexy on Secular Sexuality.
And it was just super fascinating. And so for your viewing pleasure, here is at least part of our interview.
I think the audience, before we get really deep into it, would probably benefit from a thumbnail sketch of your thesis in this second book. And I think we want to keep. I'm just saying we probably want to tie back to your first book on Alpha God occasionally, because I think there's some concepts that just kind of go back and forth between the two. But so let's focus on your second book here. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, so I develop some ideas that have been recognized by the popular media about how partisanship tends to have a gender feel to it. So, you know, conservatism tends to have a masculine feel, and political liberalism tends to have a feminine feel. In fact, Chris Matthews once called the Republican Party the daddy party, and Democrats the mommy party. So I don't often say this, but there is some empirical validity to that idea, which came out of the popular media. But so I developed the idea of, well, I focus on the evolutionary pressures that gave us political partisanship. And mostly what I focus on is the threat of germs in the evolutionary past, the challenges of rearing human offspring into independence, into adulthood, which is a huge task compared to other species. We spend so much time in independence. And dealing with the hostility of outside tribes, which has shaped our political psychology in so many ways. You know, but before we even talk about this, I always have to give this caveat that when we talk about evolutionary science, we got to be careful not to make what's called the naturalistic fallacy. Just because something's arrived at through genetic means or through biological means does not mean that it's necessarily moral or that it's inevitable, because sometimes, a lot of times, it's neither of those things. But so. And also to point out that a lot of our evolutionary psychology is under the radar of consciousness, what has been termed, you know, instinct blindness. So, you know, we have all these preferences, all these likes, all these passions, all these dislikes, including in politics, but we're largely not aware of them. So what I'm trying to do, along with so many other people who write in the evolutionary sciences, is bring these impulses up for rational examination.
The unconscious biases. The
unconscious biases, why somebody might be inspired or repelled by the words of a president, why somebody might feel so strongly about a particular policy. Some people have these very strong feelings
like
about
what we
politics.
might call a gut reaction.
A gut reaction, Absolutely, and a lot of times people can't really explain why, and they have this gut reaction without even knowing, what a particular policy stands for. So,
can you give us some examples of the instinct blindness? Because I thought that was a key part to the whole book. But you really have to understand it to see how it plays into everything.
Oh, I mean, just on a very broad scale. So, for example, it benefits us to love our children, right? And we love our children. We want an attractive mate. So we may have lust for an attractive mate, but we normally don't think about the the fitness gains, the genetic fitness gains that we stand to have from those emotions, right? That's meant to perpetuate our genes into future generations. So. Preferences for taller leaders, for example. There was a study looking at U.S. Presidential elections over 300 years and found that in the vast majority of these elections, the taller of the candidate won. And all candidates were, on average, taller than the average male in the U.S. So do we consciously think, oh, I want a big president? Maybe, but probably not. But it has some appeal, obviously, because it's reflected in who we vote for. So those kinds of things. And all this is very, very, very primitive. So it ties back to a time where I think critical for understanding both my books is the fact that most of our human evolution was very fraught. When we were hunter-gatherers, there was danger all around us. And despite what some of my fellow lefty scholars would wish to argue, there was a lot of human-on-human violence. So one researcher looked at, for example, contemporary foragers, which are hunter-gatherers who do some basic gardening, right, and found that up to 30% of all the men get killed by male-on-male violence. That is astoundingly high. And we can also deduce from looking at the archaeological records, seeing all these massacre sites where it's obvious a massacre took place. So that pressure downstream, millions of years later, has resulted in certain political preferences.
So whether we acknowledge consciously the bias toward or against violence, it is still there unconsciously. So we do have this dynamic where we don't maybe physically fight, but we do politically fight.
We politically fight. We form political tribes. They can be very insular. I mean, one thing is for sure, we evolved in these small, close-knit groups of people that identified the in-group, identified rules for the in-group, and morality did not extend much past that. So
not only to mention that these groups, these tribes, were not huge. They were small enough to where everyone knew everyone else.
Yeah. What's known as Dunbar's number. So they're topping out about 150 people. So interestingly, when you look at business, when you look at military organization, like most groups are like 150 people because organization starts to break down when you get larger than that. So even big organizations are chunked that way.
Right.
So we have this tribalistic brain, and it gets enacted in politics. And the biggest thing I want people to know from both of these books is that if you don't know your evolved psychology, others who know it better are going to use it to manipulate you.
Hack that, yeah.
Yes.
They're going to hack it.
It's a little uncomfortable to look at these things in this way. I mean, in your book, you use the phrase, making the natural seem strange.
Yeah.
And it really does feel that way because a lot of your suppositions or some of the premises are fairly straightforward, but they also feel like they're coming at you sideways. And that's, to me, what's so confusing and interesting about evolutionary psychology as a field.
Yeah, making the natural seem strange, that was a recommendation by the great American psychologist William James, and who said, a lot of these processes are so intuitive and they're so reflexive that in order to really see them, you have to distance yourself from things that seem natural. Like, well, of course we love our children, but why?
Right.
What purpose does that serve? Of course, we want a sexy partner. Okay, but what purpose does that serve? Making the natural seem strange, and you have to do that. And it can be uncomfortable. But I think evolutionary science can be like good psychotherapy. It may show you not what you want to see, but what you need to see.
And
pointing out those biases and understanding yourself better.
Exactly.
Every day we make food choices. And I mean, that's really on a daily basis. And those food choices, for example, do I like sugar? I did a 23andMe recently, and it said I like salt more than sugar, right? So that is baked right into my genetics that I'm going to prefer salty potato chips probably to a piece of candy. That is really, really basic stuff, what I choose to eat every day. And we can expand that then and look at what other things are being influenced, what other decisions besides what I choose to eat for lunch could be being directly impacted. I mean, whether I can drink milk or not is, we know that's genetic. There's a whole genetic piece of that. But I'm just guessing. I'm just trying to bring it down to the level of the listener. You make decisions every day that are impacted by this instinct blindness. You don't even know you're making that choice based on your genetics. So,
absolutely.
I don't know. What do you think of that?
That's absolutely true. I mean, it boils down to our physiology. It boils down to our endocrinology, our neurochemistry. But I think the part that I believe requires the most scrutiny is those impulses that cause aggression and social breakdown and oppression, things like that. So that's one example. Okay, so when you look at our fear of germs, they fall on a natural curve, right? The bell-shaped curve. So we all have differences in how much we fear germs, and there are these really cool questionnaires designed to get at this. So, asking people how much they'd be grossed out by eating monkey meat, for example, or seeing an unflushed stool in the toilet, gross stuff like that. So you can rate that on the natural curve. Well, when you also look at political orientation, it maps on almost perfectly. So people on the conservative end of the spectrum tend to fear germs more. People on the more liberal end tend to fear germs far less. So also fear of outsiders, fear of new people. That falls on the natural curve, and it maps on almost perfectly with political orientation. So when you think about this, in our ancestral past, we were very vulnerable to outside diseases. I mean, how many Native Americans got wiped out by things that European community for? Millions probably. So the threat of outside diseases, even for something as simple as like the common cold, was very real. Who brought outside diseases? How did you arrive at those pathogens? Well, it's usually newcomers who brought diseases that you didn't have an immunity for. So it made sense to...
The correlation, not necessarily causation, but the correlation was obvious to those who were getting sick. Oh, new people came in, we got sick. Must be new people.
Well, obvious or not obvious, it might be that instinctual fear of others and outsiders that we don't necessarily associate with germs directly or thinking about it in that way, but that's sort of what's at play there, or what we've been selected for millions of years.
Sure.
Is that about right?
Sure. So in that kind of environment, it actually makes evolutionary sense to develop a prejudicial psychology against outsiders, because that could prevent you from getting pathogens that just wipe out your entire clan. The big question is how much that serves us now that we know about basic hand washing, and basics, we have vaccines, we have antibiotics. Does that really serve us to have that psychology? The other thing is that gets manipulated.
Well, hello there.
Howdy, yeah, cut that just a little bit shy, but it was a really interesting conversation, and it's kind of fun going back over it and seeing, the questions I didn't get answered and sort of the things that, just fascinate me about this whole field.
Yeah, and like I said before, I totally nerded out during this entire interview, so I was just so... with the whole topic and the whole thing. So I think what what he was going to finish
Leading
off
up
with
to,
is that these things, reiterating that these things are hijacked, these biological imperatives that we have that have evolved over so much time have been hacked for alternate purposes.
Yeah, that they were incredibly useful in getting us this far. And it's sort of built into our DNA because people who didn't have that instinct died off, didn't reproduce.
Right.
And so now we're sort of stuck with all of these things that got us this far.
What
and
we could maybe call like evolutionary baggage.
Yeah, and in some ways they're like vestigial organs. I mean, they're very useful and they're defensive. And they, again, these are our defense mechanisms, whether we're talking about biologically or socially or whatever else, that allowed us to become the dominant species on the planet. So, great, awesome.
Right.
But it's 2019. We are evolved beyond that. And
Our society has evolved beyond that.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily need to see, say, a caravan of women and children coming up towards our southern border with this fear of outsiders and this concern of disease, when in our modern world...
We have vaccines for that.
Yeah, we have ways around that, and we have, a desire to see all humans flourish rather than just our local tribe.
Right. And being the ACA, the Atheist Community of Austin, I would say that not every atheist would call themselves also a humanist, but I would say the Atheist Community of Austin would also call itself humanist.
A humanist
community. And, using that to remind ourselves that we can overcome these evolutionary imperatives.
Sure.
And get
we have an
beyond
opportunity
these...
to be better.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we've invented culture and agriculture and medicine and, all of these things.
And if we can just consciously recognize, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the conversation later, if we can consciously recognize that these things are happening and that these mechanisms exist, then maybe we can start realizing that we don't have to just follow our biology and we can be better humans.
Yeah, and we'll get back into the conversation. I think Hector lays this out really well, but the important thing that he harps on is the fact that these exploits, if you will, these holes in our thinking exist. And us learning about them is a way of, working around them and evolving beyond them. But whether we're doing that or not, advertisers are doing it. Super PACs are doing it. Politicians are doing it. And so becoming aware of them is a really important way of sort of protecting ourselves and protecting our society from some of these really
manipulation,
outdated, thought processes that are being manipulated.
And if any of you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, please feel free to call us at 512-686-0279. And that number is also on your screen in case you forget it. Christy, did you have any comments, say like and subscribing comments that you wanted to get into?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it always helps us out and helps new people find the show, so we do appreciate when you do that. I also wanted to mention, right as we jump into the next clip, that the voice you're hearing, we apologize for not mentioning, that is Dr. Darrel Ray, our producer emeritus and
founder of the show.
Yeah, so he jumped on the phone and joined us in that conversation.
We did have some technical issues, otherwise he totally would have joined us in video, but I actually saw Mark, our producer, and Darrel working out some of those bugs just yesterday.
Okay, so we're going to have his wonderful face joining us here soon.
Yes, one can only hope. But with that, I think I would just like to say again, like, subscribe, please. That's how we get out and about. As they say, and also if you have any questions, 512-686-0279. And with that, Ben, our current producer, would you like to roll the next thing? We evolved all of these unconscious biases as a part of a survival mechanism for evolution, or through evolution. Do you think that the society we've created evolved faster than we were able to evolve out of these biases?
That's a terrific question. Yes, I do. I do. I mean, the world we have created around us is an eye blink of time on an evolutionary scale. We've only been occupying this world for a second, you know. So comparatively, so we're moving into a more globally interconnected world that's connected through economies, through culture, through infrastructure, through space, you know, and so you know,
society's larger than we were ever evolved to handle,
and more diverse and more integrated. So we have to pay attention to those impulses that cause the, you know, societal unrest and breakdown, and you know, get people to fighting in the streets over policy, like we've seen since the 2016 election. You know, there's been a lot of division. So that's, you know, overall, that's the main goal, I think, of both of my books, to understand where this comes from. Because if we understand it, we're going to be, you know, are we going to be more or less likely to enact these impulses?
One of the things that occurred to me as I was reading the book is, and I think you addressed it, but correct me again if I'm wrong, but, you know, the whole notion of germs is a fairly modern idea. It's only been around for less than 200 years.
Right.
And yet this issue is really not germs. Although we use the word germs, it's really around just disease. And if you look back thousands of years, you always other what other group with the notion that they are diseased. I mean, whether it was Jews or gypsies or Haitians, or, you know, any number of people that we have always othered with the notion of disease. I think that's a powerful idea once you understand how that works in us. Then we can be manipulated all over the place by those who would use that fear for us. And it's a very natural, normal thing to be afraid of disease, because it's going to kill our kids, and we want to protect our kids and so forth. Yeah.
Well, I also think it's really interesting that, you know, as natural and it's sort of intuitive, I guess, as this othering of foreigners and different things feels, the fact that we do have such, like, much more strict laws with regards to protecting people in those situations. So, you know, our hate crime laws are a lot more strict than if you were to commit a crime against somebody, you know, in the in-group. And I'm wondering if that is a reaction to this, you know, very strong drive, or where that's coming from, why we see that as so condemnable.
I think sensible policy, sensible legislation takes into account these evolutionary impulses. So you know, on the topic of sexuality, so one of the things I write about in both my books is how much of our politics and how much of our religions are grounded in male mate competition. Males compete for mates, and you know, writ large, I think, you know, conservatism, political conservatism, is based on favoring male reproductive interests. So that's why in the most conservative societies, you see mate guarding so powerfully embedded in those societies. So there's been these
to the detriment of the females.
To the absolute detriment of the females. So it's you know, one sex's strategy has absolute dominion over the other. So when we look at the most politically conservative societies across the world, overwhelmingly, they tend to be Muslim majority. Overwhelmingly, they tend to be, you know, patriarchal, and they tend to restrict women's movement, all towards preventing cuckoldry. You know, this idea that, you know, you know, to prevent the risk of you raising another man's offspring, which is evolutionarily dangerous. So women in these societies, you know, all of the oppressive laws and dictates are based on that. Not letting women leave the house without a male chaperone. You know, not letting
drive, expose their faces. I mean, these kinds of things.
Drive, expose their faces.
Not only that, but there's also the societal pressure for the women themselves to be chaste, to be, you know, beholding only to one partner, which is an extreme pressure that we still, I mean, slut shaming and all of these societal pressures on the idea of the female only having one mate or one mate at a time to ensure, you know, theoretically where the offspring is coming from.
Yeah, and it's just, you know, some of these laws are just, you know, from from the perspective of humanism are just absolutely absurd. Like, you know, or practices, I should say. So women getting murdered for getting raped or getting beaten for getting raped.
Something completely against their control, and yet
Right.
they suffer consequences
They've, in a
outside
way,
of that.
failed to maintain their chastity and their protection of the male resources, you know, towards raising children.
Yes.
One thing that kind of was very enlightening in doing the research for this book, and whenever you write a book, you're teaching yourself, you know. So I'm like learning things and going, wow,
Yeah,
oh my
sure,
gosh,
yeah.
right, Darrel? Was that, you know, in non-human animals, when there is a different, like the sex ratio is off, we have more of one sex, mate guarding increases to deal with the surplus of rivals. So the most skewed sex ratios are also in Islamic nations. So you have the highest mate guarding and the highest skewed sex ratios, where you have more men in those societies.
Competing for the female resource.
Competing for the female resources. So we see this in other species. We have to understand, you know, what pushes these things, and you know, a lot of this is as a result of sex-selective, you know, aborticide and femicide and things like that cause that. But this is straight-up evolutionary biology working its way into policy that I think is impressive. So.
And
Yeah, if you look at the places in just the United States that are most conservative, mate guarding tradition. I mean, the whole Southern tradition of male dueling and stuff like that happened earlier in the nation's history. That ties into all that. The male's honor is tied up with his female and ownership of that female and that sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
And I think bringing it back to the idea of disease, in politics nowadays, I hear quite often the word plague being used. This you know, what is it? Teenage pregnancy. It's a plague across the nation. You know, STDs. This is a plague across these. Using that innate fear to press an agenda by describing an entire action or a group of people as a plague.
Absolutely, and look, you know, these big media outlets, political handlers who work on, you know, for example, Trump's campaign or anybody's campaign, they know this research.
I love our audience.
They
but I don't
know
always
this research.
understand them.
So that's not on accident. That's a
read
good observation. I don't think that's on accident, because they know that their viewership, their electorate is going to respond to those things. So, and Darrel, you're right. I mean, during the Holocaust, Jews were framed as vermin. Well, vermin carry disease. You know, Trump has talked about how immigrants are going to come in and infest our country. So, none of this is accidental.
No, and in the middle, not the Middle Ages, but in the 30 Years' War, the references to disease of the Protestants or the Catholics, depending on which side you're on. The other side was disease, or was bringing disease, or was poisoning the wells with disease. You know, there's all sorts of disease references in the 30 Years' War, and it's one of the most devastating wars in human history, just in terms of percentage of population that were killed. And a lot of them were killed by disease.
And Christian on Christian.
Yeah, and Christian on Christian, right, yeah.
Protestant, like
Part
you
of
were
the
saying,
reason the
Protestants
disease
can't.
was so prevalent is you have armies running around with no sanitation. Well, they bring tons of disease with them when those armies run around, so you could easily associate armies with disease and infestation. I mean, all these things start coming together. And I have one thought. After I finished the book, I just sat around for a week or so. I didn't even tell you I was finished with it. Hector, not because I didn't want to. I was just thinking about it. You really triggered a bunch of ideas and thoughts. But I have one, and this may be an unfair question. Save it for later or don't answer it if you don't want to yet. But once you finished that book and you sat back and you thought about it for a few months yourself, did any new ideas come to you that thought, dang, not that you would have included them in the book, but important ideas that you would like to tell us today? I didn't know if anything came to mind.
Well, you know, framing things in a certain way. So you know, just how male coalitionary violence has shaped both conservatism and liberalism. So to make the natural seem strange, let's think about this for a second. So male competition among chimpanzees. Sometimes it's easier to look at other species, right? That's how we make the natural seem strange.
And we don't have all that baggage that we're bringing to it as we're watching them fight and everything. We're not, seeing our own blue versus red and all of that.
Our own.
Oh, sure. That's just basic. I mean, as you'll learn as a therapist, it's way easier to see somebody else's stuff than one's own. Mm-hmm. So within there's within competition in a chimpanzee troop, right? And usually, males compete for dominance, and that confers, sexual dominance. That confers, just more copulations than opportunity. Opportunity. There's competition for food, right? So that can be violent. But it's driven by male mate competition, because the more dominant the male, the more that male reproduces his genes into future generations. So in many ways, liberalism is developed as a psychology to help cope with that kind of arrangement, and to help prevent those males at the apex of the primate dominance hierarchy from getting too much control and impinging on your own reproductive imperatives, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why so many people who are lower on the rung tend to support liberal policies, like ethnic minorities, like women, and that's why it's so much about checks and balances on those in power. Liberals are way more for that. Liberals are way more for redistribution of power and greater opportunities and redistribution of wealth. But there's also competition between groups, and you see this if you ever get a chance to see this on YouTube. Just Google chimpanzee raids or chimpanzee warfare. Mm-hmm. All male groups forming these coalitions, when they walk silently through the jungle, conduct these vicious attacks on the rival chimpanzee troop if they find like a lone male or a smaller party, and just tear them to pieces. Well, they keep doing that, and eventually they wipe out the entire chimpanzee troop, absorb all its females, take over its territory. Mm-hmm. That is mate competition on a group level. Mm-hmm. So a lot of political conservatism was based on this behavior among humans, because humans did this forever and ever.
It's imperial expansion.
And it has reproductive rewards. So we can see when we apply our evolutionary forensics to political partisanship, you see this male coalitionary violence. You see its fingerprints all over political conservatism. So take, for example, this measure used to this questionnaire used to measure political conservatism, called right-wing authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. So this was developed in the aftermath of World War II, when we were trying to make sense of, what in the hell gave the world Adolf Hitler?
Mm-hmm. How could this have happened? How could people be so subservient to power authorities and things?
Precisely.
Why didn't someone stand up?
Why didn't somebody stand up? How could we have fallen into this? Mm-hmm. So, in fact, one of the three factors is submitting to authority figures, mm-hmm. right? Submitting control to authority figures, to those who are in power. It's usually men. Mm-hmm. It's usually powerful men. It's usually big men, all right? Conforming to social norms, conforming to group norms, conformity,
groupthink.
Rules, groupthink, and aggressing against outsiders. That's the third major factor. So when we look at that maps on almost perfectly with the organization of the military. Mm-hmm. That is military social organization. You defer to those in positions of power. You have to have that. If decision making was democratic, and soldiers weren't especially obliged to obey commands, how quickly would that group get slaughtered against the outside tribe?
Mm-hmm. And how many things would actually get done?
Right? Conformity, you see that so much in the military. Conformity to dress, to haircuts, to lingo, to rules. Rules are very strictly applied.
And hierarchy.
Because who sets the rules? The person at the top. So, and also aggressing against outsiders is the very purpose of military. So, right-wing authoritarianism has a militaristic purpose to it. Mm-hmm. And who comprises the military? Well, it's male coalitions who, for our entire history as a species, we've engaged in these kind of raids against one another to gain territory, to gain women, to gain, all the resources within territory. So that it has a martial purpose, and it's very old and it's very primitive. And so people in the more conservative end, they're going to give up control to those in authority.
So to your point,
Well, and in some ways,
oh, sorry, go
in
ahead.
some ways, the winners are the people who are sitting here today, in this on the planet today.
The winners are what?
Well, the winners of that contest over the last 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 years are the ones that are alive today.
Had the opportunity to reproduce and continue to do so.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, that's in our all of our genome to one extent or another. But so what I like to geek out on a little bit, throughout all the talks that I give in these two books is like how they appeal to largeness. They appeal to, if you're looking up to authority figure, having a big leader is emotionally intuitive to us.
Physically overbearing.
Physically overbearing, right? I mean, Donald Trump went on and on and on about, disparaging his rivals as little Marco, little George Stephanopoulos. They're little, I'm big, Who cares? Is he ever going to really represent us in a physical fight? No. Is it intuitive to our evolved psychology? It sure appears that way.
These insults about him having little
There's
hands
little
and how that got under his skin and
yeah.
everything, that all speaks to his fitness
self-image.
to actually fight for us in a very literal sense, even if that's not anything that we would need from him, from our commander-in-chief.
Right. I don't know if it is evolution on the part of the female for us to look for the stronger, the dominant, the one that we can hope will be able to protect our offspring.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, Ann Coulter said, was just all over Trump at first. She's like, basically what did it for me was his promise to protect us from the Mexican rapists. To protect us. I would walk on glass for him, she said. She's changed her mind. She's called him an idiot since then. But yeah, that's a strong appeal.
It took a little while.
It took a little while. But not only that, but when there's an appeal to those kind of men, because if you're living in an environment that's full of danger, and that there are these power struggles that are won by violence and size, you're going to want male offspring that can compete in those environments, right? So there's an appeal to those men for what they can provide for you in terms of your male offspring that you make with that person. It's called the sexy son hypothesis. So in that kind of environment, do you really want to mate with timid, small,
even if they're going to share their power with you, even if they're going to in some ways, offer the woman more opportunity or more resources, or maybe not more resources, but just more privilege, as we kind of look at that dichotomy between liberalism and conservatism, there's, more sharing of power, but not as much protection.
Well,
Brain versus brawn.
Yeah, it can be brain versus brawn. So it's all complicated, and it works off all these pressures that we've been experiencing. So in more fraught environments, women tend to prefer more masculine males with higher testosterone. Another thing about higher testosterone is that testosterone is an immunosuppressant. So in places have a lot of disease, if you're able to have big muscles and being manly, you got a good immune system. So in places where there's more disease, women tend to prefer that more. And doesn't that blow your mind? So all this is happening underneath the radar of our consciousness. In fact, the more we move away from the equator, where there's more contagious disease in hotter climates, the more liberal people become, because germs are influencing us.
Germs are influencing us.
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it has, shaped our society, shaped our species, really.
Yeah. I mean, any disease or germ that we have come up against, and I use the royal we, of course.
Right.
The human race has come up against has either been done for or has managed to somehow beat it back.
Right. Yeah. I think of War of the Worlds and, just the things that it took for our species to survive. And, some of the baggage, like you said, that we carry with us because of that. As a therapist, there's something I've said on this show many times that I just couldn't shake while we were watching this episode about how, when it comes to our thoughts, our emotions, those just happen. Those aren't ever anything I ask people to apologize for. It's our actions, our words, our deeds that we need to be held accountable for. So for me, one of the beautiful things about this thought process, these thought experiments of understanding ourselves and our species from an evolutionary standpoint, is getting a little bit of an explanation on where some of those thoughts are coming from.
Yeah, so you can explain a little bit and not have such an, oh my God, I'm such a horrible person feeling.
Yeah.
It's no, this is where this is coming from, but that doesn't mean I can't rise above that.
Exactly. You're not a monster for being maybe a little afraid of strangers, for being afraid of people from other countries. I mean, these are very natural impulses, but like Hector said, we don't want to make the naturalistic fallacy and assume that just because something is natural,
it's right.
It's right or good or inevitable. Those feelings might come from somewhere deep in our genetic code, but as evolved beings, we have the opportunity now to understand those feelings and control them and drive them towards a better world.
And we have evolved a society past our human evolution, our societal evolution, and the evolution of
the technology of our culture.
Right, the technology and the scientific knowledge that we have now has brought us to a point where maybe those things don't need to be as scary. Now, you can feel that gut reaction, but then take a moment and think, is that gut reaction because there's an actual danger to myself or, those I care about? Or is this just some gut reaction vestigial left over from, the evolutionary process where it was a real danger?
Yeah, those emotions are very human. What you choose to do with them is who you are as a person.
Right.
And who we aspire to. Yeah.
And I think with that, we still do not have any callers. So please, 512-686-0279 if you'd like to call in. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And with that, Ben, would you like to roll the next one? The idea of the social liberalism, do you find that also maybe a human attempt to socially evolve rather than, to socially evolve faster than we have been able to physically and chemically evolve, to kind of compensate, like Christy was saying, compensate for the overwhelming amount of what we would call today what am I thinking of? Masculine dominance.
Machismo, testosterone.
Yeah. Those things that we find in a civil society can cause issues.
Well, that's a great question, and I always like to point out that I war studies is my focus, and I think it's important to understand that we have these old impulses that are based on competition to do terrible things to one another, because understanding those is a route to producing more peaceable, more humane, more constructive, more stable societies. But we also have the capacity for great empathy, and that's part of our genetic legacy as well, in
that small group.
In that small group, and sometimes between groups. So I think that is the liberal endeavor. So there's research suggesting that part of liberalism may have developed as a way to help us immigrate, right? Because liberals tend to be far more interested in people and outside people. Yep. So
curious would be probably one good way to put it.
Curiosity is in many ways, especially concerning other people, is one of those factors, and we call that xenophilia. So interested in other people, interested in other cultures, interested in traveling, which may have served us as well, which extends the cooperative exchange across groups. And that facilitated us to migrate and populate the world and to interact with the people we encountered.
So if we simplify and perhaps oversimplify, but we see this sort of conservatism, distrust of outsiders, deference to leaders, things like that, as a way of protecting the tribe during especially war times or times of significant distress, and then liberalism as a way of sort of distributing power, keeping the people on top in check, and those two sort of checks and balances. You talk in Alpha God an awful lot about how the male god is sort of like the ultimate representation of masculinity and maybe of that sort of conservative value. That being said, as over the entire globe, as life expectancies go up, food shortages go down, these sorts of things, can we correlate or see a decrease in religion as things continue in that direction?
Oh boy. Well, I hope so. I think a lot of things may contribute to that, just access to information. But I think I get your point. The point is that was, having that kind of God was something we're drawn to in times of distress, right? When we become safer or more certain in our ability to survive, our ability to gain just the basic resources we need to survive, will we glom onto that less? A lot of people suggest that. When there's less uncertainty, you glom onto religion less. When there's good social services, when there's good social, like in Scandinavia, where if you're struggling, the state's going to get your back. There's less religion in these countries because
there's community support outside of the religious structure.
Yeah, fear drives us towards religion for sure. Existential uncertainty drives us towards religion, no question. But it does so on these real primitive pathways.
Male coalitional violence doesn't get you anywhere in Sweden, whereas it might get you somewhere in some other patriarchal conservative society.
So being like brash and pushing people around and bullying people in the boardroom, you're suggesting might be more successful in Iran than in Scandinavia. Is that kind of what you mean, Darrel?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and partly because there's better social services for women, though you don't have to rely on men to access to resources, because you have paid maternity leave, you have a really solid welfare system, you have state-run childcare services.
I want to take a moment because this is secular sexuality, and I want to kind of dive a little deeper into the idea of how all of this has created this culture we have now, where we're slowly working our way toward a bit more equality, but we are by and far away from equality across the board. And what evidence did you come across that would lend itself for an explanation, more than we've already discussed, of in this day and age, this modern day and age, we still have, like you were saying, tapping into these unconscious biases. Maybe what can we do to help alleviate some of that?
Critical thinking skills, they need to be taught. They need to be a mandatory part of public education. That's something that's not talked about. Teaching us about our cognitive biases, motivated reasoning, and like all the slew of biases that are studied by cognitive psychologists, teaching that at a young age. That can be done. Teaching people this science, protecting this science, which shows that, that we have these very emotionally powerful impulses that can get manipulated by those in power. For example, there was one senator, I forget who it was, but he said that one of the causes of the Columbine shooting was moms who take birth control pills. Exactly.
I didn't hear that one.
Yeah, trying to scare women out of sexual independence. By saying your children are going to get killed
if you take birth control.
If you take it's something's right out of something you hear in Iran,
and completely unfounded too.
Can you guess what party that statement came from?
Let me take a moment. This one's a brain bender.
Yeah.
Well, knowing what you've written in both books, actually, you could almost put together a playbook for manipulating human polity, human political systems. I know that playbook exists. It may not exist in using the terminology that you use, Hector, but you keep suggesting that the people who are running elections know this stuff.
They know this stuff.
Where else are you seeing? I'm just curious. Where else are you seeing evidence that those biases are being
exploited,
programmed, or influenced?
Oh,
yeah,
in the
exploited,
marketplace.
right.
In the marketplace. So Alex Jones. What's amazing me is he's from here, right?
He's
we
in
don't
Austin.
we don't talk about that.
We don't. Our people do not know his people.
Yeah. Well, so he has this guy come on his show, Dr. Edward Group III. And it's
a name. Okay.
Yeah. Last week tonight, you got to watch this episode. Mm-hmm. So he says he's an MIT alum. He's a doctor. MIT later on, refuted, he's not an MIT alum.
Oh, it's like he came to talk to us once or something.
He came to talk to us once, and so, for example, Alex Jones makes a fortune selling these worthless products. Mm-hmm. And he was selling supplements on one of his shows, and so he has this guy, Edward Group, come on and says, yeah, I mean, you need to take these supplements because the CDC is going crazy right now with all these immigrants coming in and bringing disease. So, that's a manipulation right there. But the interesting thing is, he's using it to manipulate his own tribe. He's using it to manipulate his own tribe to buy his
more power.
products.
Get resources. Take their money and raise his own profile.
And there's research out there showing that people on the conservative end of the political spectrum, this is objective research, are more credulous. They can be manipulated more, especially when fear is involved. So there's a whole section of our populace who's just getting manipulated. It makes me mad for them.
Well, and that makes me think that I think often about how it seems like the older generations are more rigid and more conservative and less compassionate toward the other. And it makes me think through our history. I mean, think what generation that they're coming out of. Their parents went through, like the older generations, their parents, and as they were children, went through a series of military conflicts that they were directly affected by. Whereas even though we're dealing with, I remember I was a teenager on 9/11, but we were a degree removed from it. Unless you were right there at ground zero or, had a family member directly involved in it, you were still kind of a degree removed from it.
The likelihood that your dad went to Iraq, or
right,
that your brother,
or that you yourself were directly affected, but the older generations had it in their face a lot more. And so, do you think that could have possibly an effect on hijacking that fear response and that protection?
Well, it's interesting because after 9/11, we saw a conservative shift even among liberals.
This is true.
And there was a study looking at if you were right in the area where the attacks happened and you witnessed injury or death, you saw a shift in right-wing authoritarianism, which shows this is an ancient survival response.
We have been attacked. We must protect ourselves. We must fight back.
Yeah, against the male coalitions because, all of them were male. Just keep that in mind.
Watching that, it made me think about how, generally speaking, when you are in a conversation with someone and maybe you have differing ideas about something, the whole idea of feeling attacked And what do you do when you feel it, when you feel that your identity or you feel one of your ideas or your opinions is being attacked?
Those
you
basic
shut down.
saber-toothed tiger defending fight or flight instincts are still coming to the table, even if it's a debate rather than a fight to the death.
Right, or even if it's just a casual conversation where someone disagrees with your opinion on a matter, that immediate kind of, lockdown, bat in the hatches kind of reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that comment and the last question that you had, just kind of getting at this idea of alienation and how we are further and further and further away as a society from our genetic heritage. And that's why I think this is so valuable to understand. As we keep pointing out, as Hector mentioned, these are all part of us, and we're getting further and further away from the way that they initially made sense, right? What they were evolved to do.
Right, the mechanisms, what they were combating or what they were evolved to
selected to defend against.
Yes.
Yeah, and so now we just have them inside of us, and so getting some level of understanding and mastery of those things is incredibly important.
And with that, we actually do have one caller on the line, and of course, if you would like to call, we have about 30 minutes left in the show, so please, 512-686-0279, or if you'd like, you can go to the Atheist Community of Austin or the Atheist Experience website and click the Call the Show button.
So, with that being said, would you like to speak to Joey?
Sure.
Great.
Hi, Joey, you are on the air.
Oh, hi. So, I did have some questions about my sexuality.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
I think I might be pansexual.
Okay.
And I'm not sure how I can tell. And the thing is, my issue is, I confronted my father about it, and he said that he was going to beat me if I was, and I don't know what to do.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know what the circumstances or what that relationship looks like, or how connected you are to him or how concerned you are about those threats. I definitely want to just let you know that that's a devastating place to be in and nothing we would ever hope for you. That being said, as far as what label best describes you, I don't know that there is any genetic test or any magic way of knowing for sure, but at the same time, I don't always know that it matters. Certainly we've said on this show before that our identity, our labels, these things that we ascribe to and these things that we describe ourselves with are incredibly valuable. And a lot of people put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into defending those labels, into receiving those labels and describing themselves that way. That being said, there's no obligation to have it figured out. You don't have to go to the pan store for pansexual people to find a pan partner. You get to be in love with, to have a crush on, to have sex with the people that you want to be interested in, the people that reciprocate that feeling towards you. So whether that is a man or a woman, whether that's somebody who's non-binary or gender fluid, those labels are valuable, but only when they're useful. If it's getting in the way, if it's causing you strife, I wouldn't let that become your focus.
Yeah, I understand that. Thank you. I also did have another question. So I have a friend from Thailand, actually, and he said that there's this thing that they call ladyboys, I believe it's called. And I don't know, what would that be classified as sexuality? I believe it's called, she-male or whatever it is. I don't know the exact term for it. What kind of sexuality would that be?
Yeah, so what we're kind of trying to do there is take these very Western scholastic ideas.
Sometimes.
So those terms can be, not necessarily, but often are used that way.
Right.
But the kind of the heart of the question is, how do we take this this very specific concept that has been invented by this particular culture and sort of put it under our lens, right? Which Western scholastic academic words can we best use to describe this sort of extra or third gender?
Using the labels that we tend to use here on the show.
Right, exactly. And so that being said, it's really not, I'm not a cultural anthropologist. It's really not my place to label or describe anybody. The Thai ladyboy concept, I think, would generally fall under something that resembles our understanding of trans women. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think that from what I understand of that culture, those people do exist as a third and distinct gender. And so really, in any of this, whether we should label it this or that or the other, we want to be kind and respectful and informed about these names and about these labels, but we also just kind of want to ask the people involved. And
I would say possibly in the same way that, other languages have words for things for concepts that we do not have words for. Maybe these people encapsulate a certain part of the spectrum that in English we don't have a word for yet.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if that kind of helps settle things at all for you, Joey.
Yeah, it does. And I always thought, despite thinking I might be pansexual, that there's only two genders, male and female. So that's why I'm just so confused about all this.
Yeah.
I'm sexually confused. And honestly, I think that listening to this show, it makes me believe that you guys are a bunch of...
All right. Well, we do have a few more lines open.
We do.
And we'd love to hear from everybody else. In the meantime, I think we're going to go ahead and jump into the next clip.
Yeah, it was a good conversation.
A couple of months ago, I wrote a review on another book on evolutionary psychology, and because the internet is the internet, I immediately ended up taking it down because I got a lot of attacks, not even about the review, not even about the book, which I, kind of panned, but about how evolutionary psychology as an entire field is sexist and is just reinforcing these old narratives and giving men excuses to take power by, calling it their evolutionary birthright. And you started off by suggesting that just because something happens naturally doesn't make it right or moral.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, not to necessarily have you defend your entire field of study, but if you could address this idea that all evolutionary psychology is inherently sexist.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually something that I address in Sex, Power, and Partisanship. So making this this naturalistic fallacy, it's interesting because that can look differently depending on where you are politically. Mm-hmm. So people on the left are more likely to make the fallacy. It's more likely to sound like this: well, gender equality is desired. Therefore, any science showing gender differences, can't be true because that could lead to gender inequality. Yeah.
Sure.
On the right, it's more like, well, because there are gender differences, that justifies gender inequality, right? So, I think both of those are errors, and I think it's important to have the dispassion of a researcher when, insofar as one can, when looking at these things, saying this is just who we are. If we don't acknowledge it, we're going to be more inclined to commit these heinous things to one another, or these bad behaviors based on these old impulses. So even if it shows us something that makes us feel uncomfortable about who we are, but we can overcome that. We can overcome our genes. I mean, you're wearing eyeglasses, for example, and
I should be.
And you should be. And every bit of technology that we've ever created is an example of overcoming,
some evolutionary deficit.
I mean, even a stick poked into a ant mound is
I thought you were going to say electric socket.
Yeah, well, that too.
Yeah.
That's a Darwin Award.
Right? But yeah, when Jane Goodall is watching chimps use these tools, it's to overcome, the shortness of their own fingers or their dangers of getting bit or whatever else.
Right. So yeah, I think this field, causes a lot of anxiety in people. But I think understanding what it is and what it isn't is important. I think backing up any supposition with a lot of empirical research is important.
And going into it without any preconceived notions of what you're going to find, because then all you're doing is p-hacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, people will corrupt and use any kind of field for their own ends. I mean, what I write about in Alpha God is how Buddhism was used for war with kind of the same pattern as we saw, in Christianity during the Crusades or in Islam with jihad, So the same with science. People can corrupt that and say, no, that's how the eugenics movement got started. But that has to do with our evolved psychology. So got to understand it.
Everything, I was just going to say, really at the end of the day, everything goes back to evolution and how we have evolved, and recognizing that we have evolved. We have some maybe more evolving to do, but we need to recognize that so that we can steer, overcome being manipulated.
Absolutely. That's one big reason to understand the science. And as you know, we're in a fight in this state, to have this science taught in schools. And that's pretty serious. We're dispensing with one of the best mirrors that we have into ourselves if we start to teach creationism in schools or start to inject false uncertainty into the principles of natural selection,
Well, and as you've kind of suggested, it's especially dangerous, not just because this information exists. If we didn't understand any of these things, it would be one thing. But if we do understand them as a society and we aren't teaching them to individuals, then we know that the people at the top, the people that are in the boardrooms, people that are in the marketing meetings or behind the super PACs or whatever else, they are in possession of that knowledge, and that disparity puts the rest of us at a huge disadvantage.
It makes us much more vulnerable to manipulation, no question. Yeah. Darrel?
There's one area of research I thought was fascinating, and I think I've read more stuff since I read your book, that why do some women buy into the cultural narrative that enhances the patriarchy? I mean, why is Ann Coulter so damn gung-ho about that? Or why are there so many Fox News women that watch Fox News? And this research, and I think you cite it, Hector, the more attractive a woman is, the more likely she is to be Republican or lean towards the conservative, because she is allowed to buy into the privilege of that, of the status of.
Yeah.
Shit, now I need to go home and look at myself in the mirror a
Yeah, I
little
was
bit.
about to say, I for one have dated a number of very lovely liberal women, but your point is well taken.
Yeah, I mean, Hollywood is filled with beautiful actresses and who are liberal, for example. So whenever we talk about these stats, we have to think, more probabilistically. But yeah, so women compete with other women, and sometimes it favors women to join the male hierarchy and to favor, for example,
because they're going to win.
Because they're going to win, and to favor their husbands' game over women. So when women get married, they tend to turn more conservative.
Give up careers and support and back the male in the relationship.
Right, because they get part of that patriarchal dividend. So yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow looking at this stuff, but there's research looking at that they call the Michelle Bachmann effect, because she's very feminine looking, and so femininity, which can be measured, and attractiveness, which can be rated, predicts Congresswomen's voting record, how conservative their voting record is. And this is all based on competition. So women compete as well for resources with one another, and we got to look at that as well.
And that's blind instinct blindness, because, they don't even realize they're doing it. It's just there, just part of the equation that goes into their mind when they're making decisions.
It is, and intuitively we know this because some of these studies showed pictures of world leaders, and the subjects were naive to them, and they could just based on their looks, like how attractive men and women were, they could guess that they were more conservative or more liberal.
Kind of one thing we haven't talked at all about, and I thought maybe we'd get back to where we started here. Megan was really curious, and I think Christy as well, as what would be the evolutionary value of bukkake? Can you help us out there?
We were pondering this question before we started airing, and I'm just going to let you handle that.
Oh boy, you've stumped me. Maybe it's a side effect.
Well, I think the real question is, and this is kind of way off base from what you're writing in the book, is why do people enjoy such crazy, wild, different kinds of sex and sexuality? Bukkake being only one of them.
You know, it's part of being human. I mean, we're a very sexual species. You know, we do it a lot, not only for reproduction. We do it for fun. We do it for bonding purposes.
Entertainment,
right?
Yeah.
We're also very curious, and we're very playful too, I think, and that comes into play there.
Yeah.
So, well, we had to at least end on a note of true questioning about our sexuality.
And had to get bukkake in there somehow.
It's the internet, so eventually,
it's gonna come
all
up.
roads lead to, whether you're talking about evolutionary psychology or politics, all roads lead to bukkake, I guess. All right.
Are you familiar with our normal outro?
No.
Oh, okay. He's not familiar, Darrel. We usually sign off with Darrel's normal sign off, which is whether you are, well, we go on a riff a little.
Yeah, kind of riff on some random things that we've talked about throughout the episode, and then we wrap it up with the phrase, go home, give yourself an orgasm, or better yet, give somebody else one.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
So you ready?
So go home and give...
I know, right? This is why he does it, not me.
Glasses on.
Oh, okay. He's putting the glasses on.
Go home, give yourself an orgasm, or give somebody else one.
Yes. It was nice to get Hector to help us out with
Bring him in on that. Yeah, I got, so clearly, this is a very difficult job, right?
I mean, I'm not too...
You can't just walk in off the street and do the outro.
No, not at all. You need at least like 5 minutes of prep.
Of actual prep time, right?
Yeah.
I have to say, there's something really rewarding to be at this stage in my career and have an opportunity to sit down and talk about these incredible intellectual thoughts with two brilliant published doctors.
Yes.
And of course, have the conversation devolve into a conversation about bukkake. That's
always.
That's the life path that I'm on.
As Darrel said, it always
all roads eventually lead to internet porn and bukkake.
Yep. I have to say, I really loved spending time with Hector, and all the things he had to say, the interesting, information and insights that he had were really great, and really helped illuminate some of those topics that we talk about often, about inequality and the way that sex impacts our daily lives, that we might not think about too often, but that really is our daily life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would definitely recommend his books to anybody who's listening and who's interested in these topics. I haven't yet read Sex, Power, and Partisanship, but Alpha God was a really easy, really clear way of understanding a lot of these ideas. And I definitely think that it's the type of thing that once you're exposed to it, it kind of on its face is just sort of, okay, I get it. There's not much there. And then it just sort of shifts your entire perspective on life by, maybe it's only 2 degrees, but you'll find yourself for weeks just kind of going, Oh, that's why I honked at that asshole who cut me off. Because somehow that would save me from like orangutans or saber-toothed tigers in my evolutionary past.
Just those immediate reactions that we have to everyday life and situations that you don't really think about, but when you do think about, you're like, oh.
Yeah, and specifically, Alpha God talks a lot about just how our society, how our species came to evolve or create religion. You know, what emotional need that was filling. And, you know, there's just a part of us that has been subservient to these dominant males for so much of the history of our species that we, you know, see things like the Abrahamic God and we glob onto that and we think, oh man, this is the, you know, strength and the protection and the things that I need.
I was about to say, everyone wants protecting.
Yeah, and so it's sort of like a way of tricking ourselves into meeting that emotional need. And of course, we all understand that it's a fallacy and it's a problem, right? We feel like we're getting our needs met, but it's a lie that we're telling ourselves. And so even as we understand that, I think that it can be really useful to recognize what need was that lie trying to fill? You know, what was the function or the purpose of that lie that we keep telling each other, and why has it pervaded for so long? You know, obviously we talked to Hector. We also had Dr. Darrel Ray, and you know, his explanation of the God virus is, for my money, the most mind-blowing way of looking at and understanding the model for why we allowed religion to be such a part of our species' story.
Our model.
Yeah, how it has shaped our history so dramatically for so many thousands of years. So,
And why we do this show.
Yeah, you know, of course, we always recommend all of Dr. Ray's books, but I would also encourage people that are interested in evolutionary psychology and understanding, I guess, sort of the function of religion. Alpha God is another great place to look.
Well, I am definitely going to be picking it up next time I go to the bookstore. And, you know, with that, I just want to say another big thank you to Dr. Darrel Ray, of course, as always, and Dr. Hector Garcia, who joined us for the episode we aired tonight. And with that, Christy, would you like to take us out? Let's try this one more time.
Yeah. Okay. So, you know, whether it is your first time, whether it's pre-recorded,
or aired again,
whether it's part of your, you know, evolutionary heritage or predisposition,
or a biological urge.
Right. We just want to encourage everybody watching to go out there and give themselves a big old orgasm, or better yet, give somebody else one.
Bye.